for anyone to speak, in some sense, you need a listener. And what that means is that if you're going to be a participant in a good conversation, or we might even say a therapeutic conversation, that not only do you have to be an active speaker, but you have to be, to use a terribly cliched phrase, an active listener. And it stays a cliche unless you understand what it means, but if you understand what it means, then it can stop being a cliche. And I can tell you that if you take nothing else from this lecture, but you practice this, it will completely transform the way that you interact with people. And that's something that's worth noting too, that something like this can in fact completely transform the way that you interact with people, and that it's actually something in some sense that's simple enough to learn in a very short period of time. So Rogers said that he had noted in his interactions with people and in the clinical domain that it was very difficult for people to listen, and that most people had never really been listened to at all, or that many had never been listened to at all, never really attended to properly, let's say by their parents during their course of development, never had a mentor or a teacher who really attended to them and listened. And Rogers also noted that you listening may be thinking that that's not true of you. Let's say as a person you had people who guided you, or as a listener you're perfectly good at it. And he would say, no, probably not. And so he posited a little experiment that you could run, and I would highly recommend that you run this experiment every time you talk to people for the rest of your life, because it really works. And it points to something deep that we'll go into after the description of the practicalities. So Rogers said, it was an axiom of his theoretical stance, let's say, and derived it in no small part from the Freudian revelations. I mean, basically what Freud did in his clinical practice was have people come into his office, his clinic, lay down on a couch with him not visible, and talk. And the instruction was, say anything that comes to mind, anything and everything that comes to mind. So completely untrammeled, revelatory thought. Now, Freud's observation was that if you let people do that and maintain an active listening environment, even though you were hidden, he didn't want you to be dissuaded or persuaded in your utterances by any reflection of emotion on his face, that you would just have the opportunity to wander haphazardly through your field of thought. And what Freud came to realize was that the haphazard nature of that tended to transform rather quickly into something that was much more coherent and much less contaminated with excess emotion. And so that if you just let the revelatory process of free speech occur, that in itself was therapeutic. And that was a radical claim for its time. But in some sense, it's not that radical at all, unless you think that speech is divorced entirely from thought, which it certainly is not, although thought cannot be reduced merely to speech, because there are forms of thought that are imagistic, let's say, but certainly much of what goes on in the theaters of our imagination that constitutes thought is in the form of speech. You could say, well, we think with speech, and thought is in many ways internalized speech. And so the notion that allowing yourself to notice what you actually think about things by talking about them might be good for you if thought is in some important sense linked to, well, your bodily incarnation, let's say. And if it's not, well then what good is it? And so, technically speaking, the part of the brain that produces semantic content, the prefrontal cortex, usually in the left, but it depends to some degree on lateralization and handedness. We don't have to get into that. The prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex in the course of evolutionary history. And so what happens in the theater of thought is that potential actions and perceptions are tried out for potential utility, so they're revealed in a sense, and then potentially criticized out of existence before you implement them stupidly in behavior and die. And I believe it was Alfred North Whitehead said, the purpose of thought is to let our thoughts die instead of us, which is correct, right? It's correct biologically, it's correct technically, it's correct philosophically, and it's worth thinking about.